This panel number 2 in the afternoon is entitled Financing for Development. And we have two highly qualified speakers here to talk to us today. The first one, standing at the podium on my left, is Professor Susan Spronk. She is Associate Professor here at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. And she is a global expert on the whole issue of funding of public services, especially water, and public banks, which is something that Jose Antonio just talked about. So we're having a good segue here. The other equally distinguished speaker is Senator Rosa Galvez, a member of the Senate of Canada. She's a member of the Independent Senators Group there. She is an engineer by training and longtime professor of engineering at Université Laval in Quebec City, where she had many management responsibilities before joining the Senate a few years ago. And so we're very happy that inviting a parliamentarian is always a dicey thing because they get called away for votes and things like that. So we're lucky she could join us here today. So sans plus tarder, je passe la parole à Susan Spronk. 15 minutes pour chacun de nos intervenantes, et puis on passera à la discussion par la suite. Susan.
Great, and I don't know if you received my presentation by email, the person who's doing, yes, wonderful. Give that a minute to load. I'm Susan Spronk, and I've spent most of my career looking at social movements, especially anti-privatization movements in Latin America. I worked all over Latin America. I share Dr. Ocampo's enthusiasm for public banks. I'm going to talk about that at the end, but I'd like to begin by thanking Lauchlan for being the moderator, to the organizers for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here with Senator Galvez. So the title of my presentation is Financing Development, a Critique of Blended Financing Initiatives and Why We Need Pro-Public Alternatives. The next slide, please. What I'm going to be, next slide. Oh, do I have it? Oh, you have it. So I'm going to be inviting a collective reflection on what is the best use of our public money. It is centered around 4 different questions. What is blended finance and what problem is it trying to solve? And I'm going to be telling you about Canada's commitments. Canada very firmly embraced blended finance at the Addis Conference on Financing for Development in 2015. And we've made a number of new initiatives that I will talk about briefly in my presentation. But what are the problems with blended finance, which is also called innovative finance? I'll be focusing on the blended aspect. They're more or less synonyms because one of the things I'm going to keep repeating in this presentation is that innovative finance is supposedly innovative. It's not actually that innovative. It's a very old idea, which is to use public money to entice the private sector to do things that we want it to do. But what are the implications of Canadian support? What have been the results of blended finance? This is mostly based on our European partners that have been using blended finance in their ODA portfolios for much longer than Canada. And what are the pro-public alternatives? And this is where I have a lot in common with Dr. Ocampo in terms of looking at the role of multilateral development banks. But my passion is for national development banks and subnational development banks, with the idea that there's space for innovation at the local level that is more constrained at the multilateral level, and there are also self-hating public banks like the World Bank that keep pushing the privatization agenda. So public banks are very diverse, and we need to know a lot more about them. I need to start with the definition of ODA, or Official Development Assistance. This definition has been long-standing. There's 2 elements that I want to draw your attention to in this definition that comes from the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Development Assistance Committee. And ODA is supposed to be concessional in character with a grant element of between 10% and 45%, depending on recipient classification. That's a fancy way to say that there's different classes and that the lower income countries, 45%, much more subsidization, much more help. Wealthier countries have an element of about 10%. So again, the idea behind ODA is that this is supposed to be helping countries develop. It is a public form of money. It is subsidized by our taxes. In 2018, the OECD introduced new definitions into
really slowly came out of
official
our
development
group.
assistance is
Because,
to push
I was
forward
talking
the
about
increased use of private sector
how
instruments.
I'll
That's a fancy way to say
price say a
we're
piece
trying to entice the
$400,
private sector to do what
and wonder
we
if
want
I
them to
should
do
be
to meet sustainable
pricing
development
it
goals, for example.
50 or 300.
And we're going to start counting some of those commitments as ODA. This is incredibly controversial. It's very fraught. It's also very difficult to understand exactly what all these flows are. So I've highlighted a few things in this new definition that's been added to the other definition of ODA. So again, we're talking about the fact that now private sector instruments, which might include equity financing, which is when we buy the shares of a company, debt financing, which would be forms of loans, or other forms such as guarantees, which is where we say to the company, you will be guaranteed a purchase of X amount of product that will be produced. These are all ways to de-risk the private sector in this agenda that I think is highly problematic. And it's also highly problematic to be counting some of these instruments as ODA, because in Canada, ODA is legislated by an act that said it has to lead to poverty reduction and meet human rights standards. So what's happened since 2015? Here we have a lovely picture of our former Prime Minister mixed up with another Prime Minister. This comes from Ian Smiley's work, who I know is a friend to a lot of the folks in the room. I don't have a picture of our new Prime Minister yet, but I will flag the fact that he was the chair of the board of a private equity firm, which is all over blended finance, Brookfield. So I do not expect much change in terms of how ODA is going to be used, how our public money is going to be used under the current Prime Minister. So in 2018, Canada legislated these changes that were recommended by the OECD that I just mentioned. It's become much more difficult to understand all these flows. It's important to note as well that when we're talking about innovative finance, it doesn't mean there's new money allocated to ODA. It means a reallocation of an existing envelope where before, and this is my last point, before 2014, ODA in Canada was exclusively distributed by traditional ways, which means grants. What's a grant? Something you don't have to pay back. Now, however, since 2015 or between 2015 and 2022, the amount of loans in our ODA portfolio has increased 300%. So again, it means that our solution to the debt crisis is more debt. We're also, the Canadian government, I'll show you a few quotes from their websites, is talking a lot about new partners, new partnerships. And for example, they started a fund or a pilot project called the International Assistance Innovation Program. $1.5 billion was allocated to that program over 5 years. It was renewed in 2024. And this is a fund that is trying to also entice Canadian NGOs to get involved in the blended finance business. So Global Affairs Canada tends to talk about innovative finance and blended finance. This is a quote from their website. They say, well, there's no guaranteed definition of innovative financing for sustainable development among international partners. At a general level, the term refers to financial structures and mechanisms that mobilize, govern, or distribute funds beyond traditional donor country ODA. Many of the mechanisms involve multifaceted partnerships with new actors. So again, we have a lot of buzzwords here, right? Partnership, innovation, new, moving away from traditional. However, there haven't been new allocations. Our ODA commitments have been stagnant. It's been about 0.3 on average between 2019 and the present. And a lot of the allocations that you see here, or the spending that you see here from 2021 to 2022, include increased spending on the Ukraine, increased spending as well on in-country refugee support, which is very controversial because it does lend the question, what's the development impact of that, of the countries who we are supposed to be supporting? So again, no new commitments here, an allocation, a reallocation, posing that question again, where is our public money going and what percentage of that public money is now going towards de-risking the private sector? This comes from a guidance note from the Feminist International Assistance Policy. It may be a little difficult to see, but the top band there talks about domestic resources, and on what is your right-hand side, private capital, institutional investors on the other side. Institutional investors mean things like private equity funds, private pension funds, etc. Now you can see all these instruments that they're experimenting with. The GAC portion is the one on the left, equity, guarantees, debt, other instruments that are about making profit from development, such as impact bonds. CRCs are conditionally repayable contributions. URCs are unconditionally repayable contributions. Those means things you need to pay back again. And then AMC is advanced market commitments, and then remittances. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of this complex set of instruments, but what's important again is that these are private sources of money, and that these instruments, most of these instruments, mean that when we are lending money or using one of these instruments, whoever is receiving this instrument is going to have to deliver the service or build the infrastructure with the idea of paying back that investment, which leads to things like public-private partnerships and user fees for essential services, essential infrastructure. This is all supposedly in the name of the Sustainable Development Goals. I won't go into this since I know this is a very well-educated audience who will know what those are, but it's very expensive. The whole discourse is around the fact that there's this huge pool of private money out there. This is called the development financing gap, and we need to raise more sources of money in order to fill this gap. And so supposedly this is the only way to do it. This is an older estimate. Now, after the COVID-19 crisis, the estimate is at something like $4.2 trillion. And just to flag that in 2019, the amount of ODA that was raised to meet this $2.5 trillion gap was only 0.04%. So again, ODA is a drop in the bucket. That is true. Again, lending the question, should we be using ODA, the scarce ODA in this way to subsidize the private sector? I'm just going to skip this slide. This comes from the World Bank. So this discourse is all about maximizing resources for development, using billions of dollars to supposedly raise trillions of dollars. One of the reasons I love this graph is because it does kind of look to me like trickle-down economics. The idea is here, 4 minutes, that we're going to use capital, equity, bonds and investments, and we're going to get development returns at the end. So Canada, again, has invested a lot in blended finance. We've created a new development finance institution called FinDev. Its job is to use these instruments to support private sector development overseas. It is a Crown Corporation of Export Development Canada. In terms of what we know already is that these instruments only tend to work for middle-income countries. Only 7% went to the least developed countries. One of the passions that I've had, which is water and sanitation, only 2%. This is based on the European portfolio. Is Canada doing anything differently? We need to keep asking that question. This is a graph from Convergence, which is a dating site for blended finance investors. It's supported by the Canadian government through ODA, actually. And you can see that things like health and education are very low on the list. They are not attracting blended finance deals. Most of it goes to infrastructure. That would mean things like roads, financial services, banks, agriculture, energy. So again, you can see that this is not an instrument that is going to be able to do the work that we want to do for gender equality and health and education. Oxfam says yes. I mean, the private sector has a role to play, but the upshot of what Oxfam says about blended finance is that with the proper regulations, the private sector should be paying taxes. This is sort of the subtext of this whole blended finance agenda, and I was really happy to hear Ocampo, and I know this morning you're talking about the International Tax Cooperation Treaty, which is really important. Again, the blended finance agenda, I think, tries to subvert that agenda or take the space of that agenda, and we need to spend more time looking at that. So in sum, blended finance is more expensive than public funding, actually, because it's more expensive to lend in the private, because they don't have the guarantees of the government to be paid back. It doesn't help low-income countries. These initiatives are very complex and difficult to monitor. I'm from Ottawa. Sometimes I drive to Toronto, and there's this really terrible toll road, the 407. It is the most expensive toll road. That's a PPP. Is this what we're pushing on developing countries? Again, is this an appropriate instrument? It diverts investment from the services that low-income people need the most. Does it create additionality, which means is it crowding in or is it replacing? It's very difficult to demonstrate. Is this a good use of ODA? Critical voices are raising, though, and I'll need just 2 extra minutes. Is that okay? All right. Lawrence Summers, who was the chief economist of the World Bank in the 1990s, also worked under Obama as the chief of the National Economic Council. He wrote this really great op-ed in Project Syndicate. He was the head of a G7 panel, which was looking at questions of blended finance, and they conclude that this is a disastrous move. They, however, conclude that the answer is more blended finance. I would like to quote The Economist, which is not something that I often quote. And what they say is that they point out that 95% of infrastructure spending in the continent of Africa comes from the public purse. Why would we not try to use that money more efficiently rather than tilting at privately financed windmills? Again, the more people are poking holes in this agenda, asking questions about, is this what we want to be doing? So I think we need a pro-public agenda. We need to turn that tide back. It includes global tax reform and debt restructuring. What I've been working on with my colleagues, and I'll just end with this, is public banks and public-public partnerships. We've done a whole bunch of case studies, especially on national development banks and subnational development banks, which is basically the idea that if the bank makes a profit, that profit will be recycled into the community. Public banks can lend in domestic currency, and they also help support local wealth building. So the work that we've done on public water has demonstrated in many case studies. It's all openly available on our websites, which I will show you in a second. We have case studies from around the world, Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Even one of our chapters is on the role of the KfW, which is one of the world's most interesting national development banks. That was very essential for building water infrastructure in Palestine, in occupied Palestine. So in sum, public banks can tackle global grand challenges as a matter of policy, not profit, and that's really essential. There's more than 1,000 public banks in the world. There are more than 915, well, that's pretty accurate, 915 national and subnational public banks as part of that. All of these banks together have combined assets of exceeding $91 trillion. Again, the money is there. Why are we asking these public banks to do blending, which is really still part of the story of what's going on? Again, these public banks are very diverse. There's no guarantee that public banks will serve public purposes. Democratic governance is key. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. And
Yes, that's okay.
I now pass the mic over to Senator Galvez.
Yes, hello. So I'm not looking for your votes. I'm appointed until I'm 75, so don't worry. But the other thing is that I can say whatever I want. I'm an independent. I'm not with the Liberal, not with the NDP, not with the Bloc, with nobody. So if my presentation can... what I will present you, it's the results of what I have heard. from my perspective of sitting in the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee, my perspective sitting at the National Finances Committee, and sitting at the Interparliamentary Friendship with the World Bank. So let's start, because we professors, we like taking a lot of time and put a lot of information. So, the planetary crisis that we are living are an economic problem, and an economic and finance problem. And the planetary crisis that we are living is because our capitalist system has reached its limits. We cannot have an infinite growth in a finite planet. This has to go inside there. And I don't follow necessarily the World Economic Forum, but it is interesting to see how they relate causes, connection, and effects. And this is extremely important for us as a citizen to understand. When there is tax evasion, tax avoidance, unfair taxation, we will end up with distrusting democracy, with corruption that we talked before, and we will abandon our infrastructure, and we will take pollution and externality that nobody will pay, and we will privatize the profits and socialize the risk. So we have to shift this paradigm, because everybody thinks that GDP comes from, technology and industry. And yes, it does. But at the beginning, it comes from our nature. So more than 85% of GDP comes from natural resources, biodiversity, and ecological services. And if you look here in Canada, our economy is mostly extractivist. We don't add value. We send 99% of our oil to the south in the United States, and we sell it at $24, and it comes back as a jet fuel at $300 the barrel. Okay, so we have to know this. So if we continue doing business as usual, what money are we going to have to help the global south? How are we going to help them not committing the mistakes that we commit? There won't be money, So we have to shift this. Now, again, our infrastructure has been abandoned. In my LinkedIn, you will find several of my op-eds that I write, because I listen to many people, and then I try to condensate and produce some op-eds for the public, so the public can know. So we are not investing nothing in infrastructure. Our infrastructure is based on the last century, and yet we are talking about artificial intelligence already. There is a disconnection between our past things that we live still with an extractivist economy, and the dreams that we have about using technology as artificial intelligence. So logarithmically, every year there is going to be an extreme weather event that is going to cost more than $2 billion per year. And these losses, which the last one is like $9 billion last year, it's only 2/3, because all the other indirect, other consequence, other effects are not accounted. And this is only the Insurance Bureau that shows this. It doesn't show the health problems. It doesn't show the infrastructures that were not insured. And more, we have insurance that are leaving many regions in Canada, in the United States. Last thing is that I just came back from Denver, Colorado, and before that I was in Geneva, and people and it was with United Nations to talk about disaster risk reduction, and of course, helping the global south with their transition to energy, low carbon technology and energy transition. And things are changing. We cannot say any more climate change. People get nervous when we talk about climate change. And I agree with that, because scientists didn't call it ever climate change. They call it global warming, which is the scientific term for that. Economists, lobbyists from the petroleum convince people that it was good to call it climate change. And they say because it's positive, because people relate to climate. Well, people relate to weather. We don't relate necessarily to climate, unless to the global warming. So the economies of the countries that are still very much based on extractivism, very much on fossil fuels, is the economy of the past. And there are already many think tanks telling us that if we continue not moving in the transition, which we have not moved at all, we are going to end up with a lot of stranded assets. And that is going to impact heavily our economy. And other think tanks shows that Canada, it's about to lose like 5% of its GDP because we are still on the old extractivist economy. How many? I'm doing okay? Okay, 9 minutes. Wow. Thank you. So I helped the government in passing the bill Net Zero 2050 because we are signatories of the Paris Agreement, because we are signatories of United Nations Convention for Climate Change, and because we have also sustained here in Ottawa the biodiversity coming Montreal agreement, saying that we are going to move on our sustainable development goals, so saying that we are going to move in our biodiversity conservation, but we are not moving. We are not moving. We are already 3 strategies past, and we are not moving. So we have to change this paradigm. We have to protect nature. We have to advance reconciliation with indigenous people, and we have to really bring innovative finances, not just in the name, but in the reality. So we talk about clean energy infrastructure investment because we have to adapt and we have to turn our infrastructures resilient. We have to maintain the buildings that are already there and adapt them because every year with the extreme heat, we lose people. People die of extreme heat. Workers are impacted. We have to invest in education and in training because of what we heard this morning about artificial intelligence. The question that I wanted to ask this morning in artificial intelligence was this: at the point, who's going to tell us what is real and what is fake? And it's artificial intelligence. So we are going to have to, have an imprint of our iris or our, I don't know. So like an AI can tell us, oh, you are a real human. So you are a fact. There was a thing between the synthetic facts and the real facts. So this is important. We have to worry about the workers in the new low carbon economy and in the just transition. We know that there are some provinces that depend a lot still on the extractivism. We cannot go into the energy transition thinking that the extraction of critical minerals are going to now become the new revenue. If I can tell you, for copper, which is not a precious rare element, we recuperate some grams from a ton of residues that stays there, and then later the mine, like Jajan mine, like Bear mine in the Yukon, we have to invest 20 billion to recuperate it. We cannot continue doing that. Our economy won't take it. So I know everybody's worried about the dictator in the South, but what I can tell you, what I'm hearing, is that this transition is unstoppable. Nobody can stop the fact that the prices of solar panels, wind turbines, hydropower, waves, and tidal are in a free fall. And you know what is the great thing? Is that we didn't give any subsidy to this industry. Nothing. No subsidies. And the prices are in free fall. It's the cleanest, it's the cheapest, is independent of geopolitical issues, and it's local. So it makes you energetically.
Can I put her on? She's awesome. This is Senator Rosa Galvez.
Look for.
I guess so.
So what is missing? What is missing is the financial sector. The financial sector is not putting, and as our previous panelist said, what is the real results? What is what is happening? And it cannot happen because it's just patches. It's just patches, it's just band-aids to a system that needs to change. We went into consultations and we find out that the mission of our banks, the mission of our insurance companies, the mission of our pension plans. I go to Europe, I go to South America, and when they learn that I'm Canadian, everybody comes and shakes my hand and says, we have so much investments from the pension plans. Okay, why pension plans are not investing in renewable energy here? They are invested it in somewhere else because the return is very high. You have to make a very incredible search in Google to find out the green bonds and the green portfolios of BMO. They don't offer you when you go, but I insist, go and ask for them because it's worth it. There is a lot of conflict of interest in the deciding boards. We have to clear that. So these are some points which I have put in my Climate Aligned Finance Act, which I know is going to be difficult to pass. And I know that people are going to be against because they are still in the extractivism and they don't want to go into transition. But you know what? We have started the dialogue. We have started talking about, and now I know that people knows about it. Before, when I first came 10 years ago, so it's not like I came yesterday to Ottawa, 10 years ago, people were not talking about any of these things. So we are now dialoguing, making this conversation happening. I said the risk. So it's true that governments are saying, we'll take public money as a seed money to help the private. So we bought last year a pipeline, costed $40 billion. And they are saying that is an investment. But economists are telling us that is not an investment because we will never recuperate the money. So what it is a subsidy. It's a new subsidy. And we give between 18 and 40 billion per year to this sector, where the CEOs have bonuses in the millions per year. So again, you know, this trickle-down economy doesn't work. And that's my last one, Interagency Task Force on Finance and Development. You have heard all of this from Antonio Ocampo, so I don't want to, but it's not new ideas. I am happy for Sevilla, but there is no new ideas. It is there. We have to change the missions of the World Bank, of the IMF, or of the other multilateral banks. Just one last anecdote. In my last meeting in Washington at the World Bank, we were reminded that one of the missions of the World Bank IMF is to warn us about crisis. So, you know, I was quiet, but then at the point I said, sorry, you said this is one of your 3 principal missions, to warn, to be the monitor of what's happening in the world. Why you didn't warn us about the 2008 crisis? Why you didn't warn us about the COVID crisis? Now, why are you not warning us about the tariff crisis? So we have to change the missions of these big, huge institutions that are not adequate anymore to what the crisis that we are living today. So thank you so much. I am presenting.
Wow. That were 2 very good presentations and very complimentary to each other. So thank you to both our speakers. I'll now call for comments from the floor. I think there's a roving mic out there somewhere. There's a cluster of questions over here I can see. And if anyone online wants to ask a question, please feel free to do so. So can you please keep your questions short and to the point? And just for the benefit of the rest of us, please just identify yourself briefly with your name and your affiliation. That would be good. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lynn. I'm a student at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Thank you so much, Senator and Professor, for the two wonderful presentations. I think my first question is for Senator. Thank you for your work advocating for sustainable development and climate action. I am curious, what are some of the resistance that you face within Parliament or within your meetings? Because, the climate science, it's obvious that it's happening and it's man-made, but why aren't more things being done? And especially with the passing with Bill C5, how do you see that obstructing our work towards climate action? And then perhaps another question for Professor Spronk. So climate is often compared in importance to other priorities, such as economic development and affordability and all that. So a lot of resistance towards climate action is, I don't have time to care about climate concerns if I don't even have, enough heating or, food on the table. So how do we balance the two, the need for prosperity and then the need for sustainability, I guess? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fernanda. I'm a grad student here at the International Development Program. So I have a question for Dr. Spronk, but both of you are welcome to answer as it's a complementary question. So Dr. Spronk, you stated that innovative finance is often disguised as a new and improved practice, when in reality tends to prioritize the interests of the private sector. So my question is, how can we hold the Canadian government more accountable for the lack of new commitments and to ODA, and what benchmarks should we follow to make this happen?
We have an online question here. Would you like that added? I'll try to see it here. Rosa, thank you for your wonderful presentation. You have illustrated perfectly why we are here today in a 1944 moment. What we need is to transition from Keynesian and neoliberal economics to a regenerative economics in which we create and use a new value paradigm, a system in which central banks take a leading role. Would you agree that the economics discipline and our analytical tools need to be revised?
Okay, over to the two speakers. Why don't we start with Senator Galvez?
Okay. Yeah, of course, there is a lot of challenge, but that's the depressing part. And I am an optimist by choice. I try to be in the action because, I can cry when I hear some of my colleagues denying the global warming, denying that we are losing biodiversity, denying that we have increasing inequality, and that is very depressing. But I prefer to teach and keep spreading what I know. So, for example, one thing that I'm talking a lot about is the donut economy, and saying that the social contract that we used to have doesn't exist anymore. And especially with automatization and AI coming, we are going to go lose this social contract that said, I'm going to work for 35 years and then the government is going to take care of me. That was the social contract. But now that is changing, and young generations are changing jobs. So I talk about the donut economy because I believe in that everybody, everywhere in the world, should have a floor of rights to democracy, to health, to justice, to education. And this should be horizontal to everybody, not only in the global north, but also in the global south. And we need to have that. But there is a roof, and the roof is given by the planetary limits. We cannot keep continuing putting pollution in the rivers, plastic in the oceans, and greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, because we are going to just keep warming. And we cannot adapt forever. That's very important to make this realization. People are saying, well, we are not going to attain 1.5 max. let's go to 2. But we are already knowing, if there is a statistic that says that now construction workers are the sector that is the most affected for kidney malfunction because they are not enough hydrated. And it is unbelievable. So about the central bank question is that, coming back to what my colleague said, in Europe, the post is a bank. In Quebec, we have a mutual and we have Desjardins. And it is I have one account with Desjardins and one account with BMO. And I'm not scared of naming them. And my husband with RBC. And we compare. What is the information that we receive? What is the questions that we can ask to them? What is the mission? And it's really very different. The local, then you worry about your local things and you take care of your economy and your finances. And if you haven't watched the film Dave's Bank, I encourage you to watch it. It's incredibly educational. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to address the second question first, and then the first question and the third question, which weren't necessarily directed to me, I'm going to answer anyway, although the first one was. With respect to ODA and keeping the Canadian government to account, one of the things that I really appreciate about the Canadian ecosystem is the very robust civil society sector that we have. It certainly was more robust in the days of the former CETA when there was better relationships with people who worked in the government and with NGO partners on the ground. So that's been terribly eroded with the creation of GAC. But that said, there are still NGOs, trade unions in this country that are pushing for public alternatives, and they include One Canada, which is very critical of blended finance, Inter Pares, Oxfam. There's a whole host of NGOs and civil society organizations. I think it's up to us as well to take the government to account and ask questions about FinDev. What is the evidence that this approach is working? In terms of benchmarks, I think I saw 0.7% in Senator Galvez's presentation. That remains a goal that still needs to be part of the global conversation. We cannot cede ground to, oh, well, we might as well give up. I think ODA remains important in terms of a spirit of reparations, in terms of a spirit of thinking about the global system and the kinds of commitments that we have to each other and global humanity. In terms of the first and the second, which is more about climate and new models, one of the things that I would say about the Senator's presentation, which I agreed with 95%, the 5% is about the massive push for investment. One of the issues that we face with respect to a green and just transition is highlighted by a fantastic article and his broader work by Brett Christophers. Anyone in the room read Brett Christophers, The Price is Wrong? No? Okay. Well, what he says in this article and in this work is that one of the issues we face with the green transition is exactly what you pointed out, Senator Galvez, which is that it's cheap. That means it doesn't make much money. That feeds into this idea, because we have been thoroughly neoliberalized after 40 years of neoliberalism, that, oh, that means we need to entice the private sector. No. That means we build it ourselves as we used to do. This is what crown corporations were about and should be about. Countries have done it. Studies in the European Union have demonstrated that publicly owned utilities invest more in renewables. Uruguay, a country in the global south, which granted has a social democratic government, longstanding, 95% of their energy is renewable. It is done by publicly owned and operated companies. This remains an incredibly important point, because when we look at that graph that I showed you from Convergence, which shows the sectors that blended finance is going into, we have to ask, who owns that infrastructure? Is it some private Spanish firm that owns that road? Or is it owned by us? If it is owned by us, there is a chance for democratic control over those utilities over that infrastructure. And that's a point that I think we need to keep coming back to, because right now there's a lot of disorientation, especially under the current Carney government, where there's going to be a lot of sand thrown in our eyes in the next while in terms of, oh, no, it's going to work. It's going to be fine. No, it is not fine. It doesn't work. Postal banks are a great example. The CUPW, the trade union, has been asking for postal banks since the 1960s. Postal banks, Canada Post has the largest logistics network in this country. Why is the government allowing the CEOs of that corporation to sabotage our Crown Corporation? Again, we need to take these questions up and bring the government to account.
Let's have another round. We have a couple here out front. Is there anyone online in addition to the two in the room? Sorry, I can't see the chat here from my computer.
Okay.
No, we're not aware of another one online.
Thank you. I didn't introduce myself earlier, Mark Mossack. I'm currently with Global Affairs, used to be with CEDA, managing the development programs in Indonesia and Philippines. So I'm actually having a good day here because I'm not at work. And so my mind is really blown here. A lot of interesting stuff. So on the blended finance, I actually, I was initially a skeptic on the blended finance issue. And then when I joined the Indonesia Philippines programs, it actually is an option in middle income countries and in also other countries where the private sector is either not present or not willing to because of the perceived risk, not the real risk, perceived risk. So, you know, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm an avowed pragmatic socialist. So I don't believe in the private sector involved in healthcare, education, and even monopolistic infrastructure. I think that's wrong. But I think there is a role for blended finance where the government entices and brings the private sector in where they would not normally go because they perceive the risk as being too high. And with development programming, we can bring that perceived risk down. And so that's one. And so I think in Senator's presentation in terms of the cost of climate change and the impact, I think, having worked on climate change for a long while, it's one thing when you're being, just optimistic and just showing the theory of it. But when you show the real costs, I think that's a quite compelling story, and that needs to be told more often. We're beginning to do that in our development programming. And so countries react to when they realize what the cost is of, flash floods and things like that, which happen a lot in the countries we work in. So I think that's an argument that needs to be brought forward. And so I'd just like to hear from both of you on that. And, I'm a government employee. I can't talk to my political masters directly, although I do anonymously. I think, the Canadian population is missing the point in terms of what we can do with international assistance, the relationships it creates, and the value proposition we bring, whether it's gender, whether it's climate, whether it's, democracy. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. My name is Earl Turcott. I'm a retired public servant. Senator Galvez, with respect to, you made the comment that renewables are in free fall, I believe is what you said, which is certainly the case. And I think we have China to thank for the dropping price of photovoltaics panels. I guess my question is kind of rhetorical. If that is the case, if renewables truly are the cheapest form of energy these days, why in God's name is Ontario pushing small modular reactors? It just begs logic. Although I think, Professor Spronk, you made a comment, something to the effect that you should look at who is benefiting from the status quo. And I think there's something to be said there. If I may also say that the common wisdom is that the greatest challenge to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals is lack of capital, lack of financing. So these are hard commitments that countries around the world have made to achieve the SDGs. So I wonder why it is that NATO countries could so casually accept a 150% increase in their projected defense budgets over the next X number of years. Again, it is just astounding, unless, and I'm hoping this is the case, that they are humoring the President of the United States until he moves on. I'll let it go at that. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. Can I just ask two questions? Senator, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, where is it at in the legislative agenda? And Susan, the questions here on the piece of paper on the agenda ask us to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of public banks. Can you talk about the disadvantages for 30 seconds? Thanks.
Okay, I'll start by mentioning a part of the previous question on C5, but it's related to the why the government is doing what it's doing. So part of it is that we know a system, and we are in the inertia. So we want to see more pipelines. We want to continue with the oil and gas. One example that I am asking a lot the government is this issue with LNG. So LNG, we have a new port in Vancouver, but we don't have a lot of private investors. And the government is saying, who is the egg or the chicken? Is the government is saying, I'll put some money to de-risk, talking about perceived risk, real risk. In the case of fossil fuel, is not perceived risk, is actual measurable risk that they are doing now, the financial institutions are doing now, but they don't want to disclose it. So that's another point in my bill. We want disclosure. We want disclosure of the risk, because if you don't know what is the risk, then you just keep thinking that it's just a perceived risk. So C5 is there and is saying, well, we are going to escape some of the environmental laws that are present, and we are going to rush projects. But I can tell you something. Before C5 was accepted, there were 504 projects for a lot of billions of money already planned. So why we are picking some of them is to calm the people in Alberta, calm Mr. Trump in the South. But we are going to regret it, because we are just increasing the dependency on, we don't have any other client. And so our prime minister had to jump very fast, very quickly to Europe. But the people in the Caribbean and the people in South America are asking why he went there, why he didn't came to South America. Just about the NATO thing and the increase. So this is very interesting, because until last year, the government was telling there is no much money because we don't want to increase the deficit. We don't want to increase the deficit. And then all of a sudden, they found money to put in NATO. But if you are listening the news, there is a new way that the government is proposing to present the budget. So, evil is in the details. So now we are saying, is this new way of presenting the budget going to not play with the numbers, because we're being assured that accountants, standard accounting should pick it up very quickly, because the approval of the budget, it's very much independent of how much deficit the government is going to declare, okay? There is no secret. So of course, they are worrying how they're going to present this deficit. And of course, there is going to be deficit because we just found money to put it into the defense. SMRs, exactly as carbon capture and storage, has been in development for the last 30 years. And earlier we were talking about pilots. The pilots are still there, but it's not much progress. And in any ways, they are saying it's for the Arctic. But these small compact reactors need a very highly trained people. So there's a lot of complex problems before we get to deploy them. Thank you.
Okay, so we have someone who was skeptical and now has been convinced that blended finance has a role. I think twofold things I would ask questions about, and one is the risk of impact washing in this story. When you look up blended finance online, you overwhelmingly find industry reports, and also the Canadian government is pretty good at promoting blended finance. It's very clear, a lot of the information on the websites, but I have a lot of questions about how some of those numbers are generated, et cetera, gender, environment, et cetera. We've seen case studies, for example, where liquid natural gas is said to be green in some of the FinDev investments. And granted, we know a lot more about FinDev's investments than we do know about other parts of the partnership branch or the bilateral branch in those innovative projects that have been going forward. But the second one is really the thorny issue of additionality, which is something that the OECD is still struggling with as well. And they've had a number of advisories of how do we actually know that the private sector wasn't interested? They're not there. Well, okay, they're not there. Yes, but sometimes they walk away from deals if it's not. So it's about the costs and the benefits of this approach. In terms of what are the disadvantages of public banks? Well, this is the same disadvantage of any public institution, is that it does depend as well on the national government and its orientations. While, of course, public banks will have some stability in terms of their mandate, they are also vulnerable to the national government. So we cannot escape that issue. And for example, I was just reviewing a paper about Banobras, which is one of the development banks in Mexico. It's gone through lots of different iterations over its time. It was established in the 1960s. It started promoting private-public partnerships under the former governments, but in 2018, it made a turn with the election of the Morena government, and now we have a new president. And so they pulled back on the PPPs that are, 20 or 30-year contracts with guaranteed interest rates. They still have public-private partnerships, but they're shorter. There's much more control of the governments over these strategic infrastructures. So again, the national governments have a really important role to play here in terms of public banks. So this becomes that chicken and egg question in terms of, is it the public bank or the national governments, in terms of what's going to inspire what in terms of the kinds of transitions we want to see. So there will still be a need for grassroots, civil society, political parties, efforts to push our governments to be accountable, transparent, and also think about democratic control and ownership seriously.
Everyone join me in thanking our two wonderful speakers.
And we are on time. That's wonderful.